And if anybody has a question, well, particularly up front, if you have a question up front, I can hand you a mic.
Rick, I think you mentioned earlier that there's a caucus in D.C. that's made up of people on both sides of the aisle that's trying to create some new movement. Can you say anything about that?
Yeah, what Bill Clapp is referring to, he and I were talking before I stood up and you all came in. There are all kinds of efforts going on in this country to try to bridge this terrible, hyper-partisan Grand Canyon that we have in this country. We really have to get beyond it. We have to be inventive. And there's a group called No Labels, which was founded about 15, 20 years ago by Republicans and Democrats who wanted to get past party labels and try to work together without being caught up in that, and even try to put together a ticket that would be Republican for number one and Democrat for number two, or vice versa, whatever. They didn't succeed in that, but what they have succeeded in doing is they've begun recruiting members of the House of Representatives in what they call the Problem Solvers Caucus. And the Problem Solvers Caucus members commit themselves to try to find bipartisan solutions to one issue after another: immigration reform, labor laws, gun safety, whatever the issue is, women's rights, whatever. And what's interesting is they've been able to recruit 38 members, 19 Democrats and 19 Republicans. And their rule is they will not take any additional members from one party unless that person can bring in somebody from the other party along with them. And this just started in the last couple of years. And I got to tell you, 38 doesn't sound like much out of 435, and it's not. But 38 in the kind of atmosphere that we've been living through is, I think, one more measure that people are fed up with this situation and they're determined to do something. And fed up is something we can all talk about at dinner, but doing something is what we need to talk about the next morning. And that's what I'm trying to inculcate here, is this hope and this spirit and this can-do notion that people can make a difference and make a change.
Are they listed somewhere if somebody wanted to know who they were?
They are. If you go, I think you can go, I'm not certain if this is right, but I think you can go to the Problem Solvers Caucus on the internet and you can find out who they are. Yep.
Discussion has been largely focused on election reform and the gerrymandering and all those kind of issues, and recapturing democracy in that sense. I think that over the years, and I would be talking about around 50 years, is the erosion on the economic equity in the country and the imbalance, one might say, between capital and labor, that when democracy functions best is when there's closer equity in that realm. So do you see this change you're talking about bringing about the change that's been so fundamental that to me caused the anger in the voters to do some of the actions they've done?
Now, I want to say right off the bat that I did not plant that question. But I did write a book about it called Who Stole the American Dream? You have asked a jackpot question, okay? Louis Brandeis said, I think in 1916, we cannot have high concentration of wealth and a democracy. You can have one or the other, but you can't have both. There are more and more stories talking about how economists are focusing on the fact not only that there is a concentration of wealth inequality, and by the way, the wealth of the median family in America today, not today, excuse me, at the end of 2016, which is the last year for which we have full figures, was 34% below what it was in 2007 before we went into the tumble. That the share of national income going to corporate profits is the highest it's ever been, and the share going to workers' salaries and wages is the lowest in 50 years. During this stock market boom, I just read a story the other day, during the stock market boom, inequality has increased more than in any previous similar period. Stock market boom. So the issue you're talking about is absolutely central. My belief, I started with that question. That's why I wrote that book. I got into that issue and I wrote that book about inequality and what it was doing to this country. And my fear is that we can't deal with it effectively unless we fix the political system. I do believe there's good evidence, concrete evidence, not just opinion, that in fact Washington and Congress has been captured by financial interests. It's very interesting. Numbers have come out recently. As a result of the tax cuts enacted at the end of last year, lots of firms got a tax windfall. Sheldon Adelson's Las Vegas Sands company, the casino company he runs, got a $700 million tax windfall from that tax cut. He has contributed $30 million to political campaigns run by the Congressional Leadership Group, which is Paul Ryan's PAC in this election, and there are lots of others like it. So what's going on is that we have high inequality, we have a concentration of wealth and power, and by the way, there are now studies showing that there's a concentration in the profit taking, in the profit earning of a small handful, a small percentage of the companies listed on Wall Street, and that most other companies are not running at a profit. That is, not only are the assets being concentrated in very large banks and very large technical companies, very large oil companies and so forth, but the earnings and the profits are being concentrated. So that the bargaining power of labor or workers is much weaker against concentrated economic power. Labor unions have clearly suffered enormously in terms of strength and membership since the 1950s or 60s, their heyday. There's good evidence that where there are strong labor unions, that the median pay of all workers, not just those in unions, is higher. In right-to-work states where there are weaker unions, the average median pay is lower. So you're right on a very difficult issue. But it's one that is very difficult to solve within the economic system without going to the political system. And within the political system, I think it's very difficult to solve without beginning to restore that connection of people between themselves and their government. That sense that if we get out there and we vote, we get involved in a campaign, we matter, they'll hear us, and it will make a difference after the election. So I think these two sets of issues are very closely intertwined. But I'm glad you raised the question. It's absolutely critical. And the numbers keep piling up, and they suggest they're worse and worse. I mean, when I wrote that book 6 years ago. The book is more on target today than it was when I wrote it. I'm sorry to say.
So one thing that troubles me is the consolidation of such power in just two political parties. And I think it really affected this election when both parties came up with candidates that were a large part unfavorable to a large part of the population, and people chose not to vote or to vote for a smaller party. And in the history of our country, it wasn't always so. We had a time when there were several political parties that could run and put up a viable candidate and get people into offices in the Congress and the House. And it seems to me that this is a really major issue here, because you found the National Democratic Party controlling two viable candidates to the extent of really undermining one of them, which now has come out as in several illegal ways. And then you had the Republican Party just sort of not being able to get their base behind any one person and emerged with Trump, I think. But so my question is how can we change the system where that we really are going to be more represented than just these two parties, because they also controlled the elections. Okay, they controlled the elections by not having as many polling places, etc. Why does the government not run the elections?
There's no question that we have a political system now that favors parties in a way that our founding fathers would have been distressed at. There's no question that Madison, Washington, Jefferson warned us against the danger of political parties. We now have what are called poor loser laws, which mean that if you run in the party primary for some office, you cannot, and you get beaten, you cannot then run in the general election. And there are good reasons for believing that some of the losers, as I suggested, because of the nonpartisan primary system in Washington, some of the people who lose in the primary could actually win in the general. So that's depriving us of choices. So I think we have some built-in advantages for parties and disadvantages for people out of parties. I would take issue with your representation that we have had periods in American history where we've had multiple parties where people could run. We have not had it. I mean, the closest we ever came was the election of 1912 with the Bull Moose Party, with Teddy Roosevelt running against Howard Taft and Woodrow Wilson. And we came again with Ross Perot, in the 1990s, but there's never really been a successful third-party movement in American history. The only change we've seen really was the demise of the Whig Party in the 1850s and the rise of the Republican Party. But our history is pretty much a two-party history from the beginning to now. Now, in individual states, that may be different. You may be able to go to Idaho or Washington, particularly western states, and a Green Party candidate can do pretty well. You may be able to go to the southern states where you have a very, very conservative Republican Party wing and have a Libertarian Party do pretty well. But I think there was this movement, I mentioned it before in connection with the Problem Solvers Caucus in Congress. There is this movement by No Labels, which essentially is an effort to try to devise a way to put on the ballot people who are not affiliated with the two major parties. They may have the labels, but they're really running independently. And it's a very noble organization. It's gotten a lot of good things done. There are a lot of things about it that I like, but they have not been successful. I mean, I don't think the history of third-party movements and third-party efforts in America gives much optimism there. This is not to say it couldn't happen in some state, but, and I think we should get rid of some of the laws that we have that, and some of the judicial decisions that we have that favor parties, that give them an iron lock. I think party primaries are terrible. The nonpartisan primary is one of the best ways to go. And it would seem to me that in this country, with a growing number of independent voters, that should be a movement that would naturally take off, that independent voters would like that. Because once you get in there as an independent voter, the difference between this primary and other primaries is that you can, like a shoelace, you can vote for a Republican for governor, and you can vote for a Democrat for lieutenant governor, or a Democrat for senator, and you can vote, I mean, you can crisscross. And at that point, the hold of the party is being undermined. So to me, that, when looking at the practicalities of the American situation, I would say that's a much more fruitful way to go than to try to get a third party. But this isn't going to stop people from wanting to get a third party. I just would like to see real change, and I think the odds of that happening are really low. Oh, back there.
Please speak to the possible elimination of the Electoral College.
That is a critical issue, and it is changing even as we meet. There are two ways to go. One way is to try to amend the Constitution. Amending the Constitution is tough, and you've got to go through a whole lot of states that would basically lose some extra electoral votes that they have. They're highly unlikely to do that. The other way to go is the way that people are doing it right now. I've forgotten the name of the movement, but fundamentally what goes on is that the legislature in the state commits the state by law to cast that state's electoral votes for the winner of the national popular vote. Okay? So the way you get around the Electoral College is say, here we are in Michigan. I don't care, even if the Democrat wins, if the Republican wins the national popular vote, all our electoral votes go to that Republican nominee. Okay? Now, what you have at the moment is something like, and my numbers are not going to be right, but you can probably find it on my website, about states that have about 130 electoral votes have adopted that. All right? So you need, to get to 270, you need more states with 140 electoral votes. When you get to the point that you have states that have 270 or 271 electoral votes committed to voting for the winner of the national popular vote, you will effectively have eliminated the Electoral College. And at the moment, we're about halfway there. And what's interesting is it has to be passed by both houses of the state legislature. There are about 12 states where one house or the other of the state legislature has passed this. It hasn't passed in the other house during that session. You have to go back in the next session and start all over again. But people are working on this. This is another reform movement that I didn't get into today, but it is another place where people are at work trying to fix the system and get us out of the 18th century and the 21st century. Somebody back over here.
Yeah. Is it on? Yeah. I just wanted to follow up on that. The National Popular Vote Compact is the name of the organization, and it actually has 165 electoral votes now. And it's, I think, 11 states, including D.C. So it's something that our local Our Revolution tried to work on last year to get people in states where they haven't passed it yet to pass it so that we can move past the Electoral College. So if you know people in states that haven't passed it, and I couldn't rattle them off here right now, but if you Google National Popular Vote Compact, you can actually make this happen.
Yeah.
And Washington State is one of the ones that has passed it, as has California, New York, and some of the other low-hanging fruit.
By the way, this is another very important reform. My point here is this strengthens the idea that I was suggesting to you. This is not a time to feel powerless. This is actually a time to get engaged. People are engaged working on these issues. Change is happening. And these things all take time. I mean, I gave you the example of Florida trying 5 times to pass gerrymander reform until they finally did it. You have to hang in there. I mean, there are people who will say, Rick, or Mr. Smith, whatever it is, you know, you talk about this, and we tried it, and it didn't work. And I say, how many times did you try it, and when, and where? And, you know, and the answer is you got to hang in there. And people look back, just give me a moment. I covered the civil rights movement in the 1960s, and people all remember Martin Luther King giving that famous I Have a Dream speech. What they forget is it took him 9 years to get from the Montgomery bus boycott to Washington, D.C. and the Lincoln Memorial. Okay, so you got to remember, it takes time, but it does happen. Okay, great.
Money is the mother's milk of politics. And this morning I was looking at my phone, and it showed me how money is bouncing around the United States of America to help people win elections from different states that they don't even live in. How is that possible? How is it possible that an organization like the NRA gets $30 million to invest in an election? Where did it come from? Where does this money come from? How come there's no records of where this money comes from? And why should people like the Koch brothers have an effect on an election in Washington? Thank you.
Great question. Where do you live? This state?
I live right here.
Okay, great. Okay. Well, that's a very important question, and you hit a really neuralgic issue. People are really upset with out-of-state money affecting in-state elections, and they want to try to do something about it. Now, it just happens that I have a segment in my documentary, one that I didn't talk to you about earlier, that actually is addressing this question and specifically addressing the Koch network. And it addresses the way the state of California has dealt with this. It has dealt with this in a way that is more effective than almost any other state. Part of the problem with regulating political money is the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court has basically said at this point money is speech. It can't be regulated, okay? So the next best thing most people think of is disclosure, okay? So what happens is people set up organizations like Americans for Responsible Leadership, Americans for Job Security, the Center to Protect Patient Rights, and they put money into those places, and those places put the money into campaigns. And if you're sitting in Washington and you happen to be concerned about health care and somebody's put some money in, I don't know, genetically modified crops, and it says the Center to Protect Patients' Rights, well, that sounds pretty good. You're not very suspicious, but you have no idea who put that money up, okay? It does happen to be Koch money. That happens to be a Koch front, okay? Now, what's really interesting about the state of California is that they have passed a law, they have passed a bunch of laws which say that any group spending $50,000 in a California election must disclose its funders back to the basic individual funders. So it starts to go, Now, in the case that we followed, and it's really fascinating, it's a great detective story. It starts out with a group called the Small Business Action Committee in California, pumping $15 million of ads at the very end of a political campaign, 3 weeks before the end of the campaign, to defeat a ballot initiative to raise $50 million to fund public education, which happened to be the governor's particular pet, and another $10 million to beat to promote a ballot initiative which deprived labor unions of an ability to spend money in political campaigns. But they were very cleverly disguised, okay? So the Common Cause saw this in the reporting. California requires that it's reported. So the $15 million goes blip, shows up on the website. Common Cause says, where'd that come from? They start working on it, but they report it to a thing in California called the Fair Political Practices Commission. Now, typically the Fair Political Practices Commission, whatever it's called in any state, says, oh, yawn, 3 weeks before the election, no chance in the world we can get that information. We'll investigate it thoroughly after the election. But in this case, a woman named Ann Ravel, who was running the CPPC, said, we're going to find out who that is. She turned it over to a guy named Gary Winnick, who was her chief investigative officer. And it turned out the money had come from what I just said, a group in Arizona called Americans for Responsible Leadership, ho-hum, right? Well, the interesting thing about Americans for Responsible Leadership is until it spent that $15 million, it had never spent more than $50,000 in any political campaign. Bingo, somebody's playing a game, right? So they go to work on that group and they say, you got to report and you have to tell us who it is under California law now. And they resist, and they resist, and they finally get a call from a very big-name law firm in Washington, D.C. Suspicions rise even further. What? And this happens, this guy, the law firm happens to have offices in the same building as Karl Rove and a bunch of other guys, and they happen to represent the Republican National Committee in a bunch of campaign finance disputes. So they go back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. So they finally, the California Fair Political Practices Division decides they got to go to court. And literally about 10 days before the election, they file suit. A local judge says to this Americans for Responsible Leadership, you got to disclose your donors. That's what the law says. You got to do it right away. And so they start to go into a stall. And Ann Ravel says, we're going to the state Supreme Court. They go to the state Supreme Court on the Friday before Election Tuesday. Okay? The state Supreme Court meets by telephone on the weekend before, and it orders this group to disclose its funders. It looks like they're not going to do it, but the Monday before the election, it comes out, they admit it. They submit 3 letters. The Small Business Action Committee says it got its money from Americans for Responsible Leadership. Americans for Responsible Leadership says it got its money from a Virginia group, Americans for Job Security. Okay? And it passed its money to the Center to Protect Patients' Rights. All of these are part of the Koch national network. Okay, we knew that by that time. In fact, this case was the first real disclosure of how the Koch network worked. Okay, so we go into election, and Jerry Brown is beating the drums, and he's saying this is outside state money, and this is dirty money, and we're being perverted and corrupted, and all that kind of stuff. And both the ballot initiatives that the big money wanted got beaten, but we still didn't know who the funders were. So Gary Winnick goes on a 1-year-long investigation, and he tracks it back down to this Virginia group, Americans for Job Security. He finally finds that there are a couple of Republican operatives in the state of California who've been raising money from them from very wealthy Californians. Surprise, surprise. Californians are sending the money out to Virginia, back to New Jersey, back to Arizona, to get it back to California. Why? Well, some of them were good friends of Jerry Brown, and they really didn't want Jerry Brown to know that they were fighting, right? And then some of them had companies, and I'm going to tell you who they were in a minute. Some of them had companies that had unions, and they didn't want the unions to know that they were funding a thing that was against unions, right? So they were passing the money way around. So it turned out, in the end, it wasn't Koch money that was being used. It was the Coke channels that were being used by these people, okay? So what happens in the end is that Winnick forces an audit of Americans for Job Security. Now, at that point, there was a loophole in California law, which is called the first bite of the apple. If it's the first time you spent money in a California campaign, you don't have to disclose. So they went and closed that loophole immediately after this. But so what they said was, we will give you our list, but we're going to black out the names of all the donors, okay? Okay, so they're redacted. Well, the story gets better. Story gets better, okay? So a smart reporter for the Los Angeles Times holds the redacted up to the light, and through the light he can read who the donors are. And so the Los Angeles Times runs a front page story that the biggest donors are Charlie Schwab. You know, trust Charlie, right? You need to know Charlie is a hardball political player, right? Eli Broad, a supposed grand patron of education who has been funding an anti-education ballot initiative, and Max Fisher, head of the Gap, CEO of the Gap. And there are others, but those three will do. So and then what happened is, after that, they went to the legislature and they closed the first bite of the apple loophole. The answer is that we have to get away from something that is a big problem in federal law. In federal law, political action committees have to disclose their funders. Social welfare nonprofits do not. Okay? And so what's going on is, most of the money that's now going into politics through super PACs is going into social welfare. Now, social welfare nonprofits used to be your local hospital, the Boy Scouts and Girl Scouts of America. I mean, genuine social welfare organizations. But most of the Tea Party patriots and, you know, Common Cause and Planned Parenthood, I mean, let's be honest, it's on both sides. They're now social welfare. And if they don't spend more than 50% of their expenditures on politics, they don't have to disclose. And nobody knows how to get at that. Nobody's investigating that. So California has gone a step further, and they've said, we don't give a damn whether or not you're social welfare or you're political. If you spend $50,000 in a California campaign, you have to disclose. So what we need is laws like that in every state. Now, that doesn't keep the out-of-state money from coming in, but what it does do is it lets you know it. And if you've got smart in-state politicians like Jerry Brown, you make that a major issue. And it's very unpopular all over the country. I mean, I go from here to New Hampshire, and there's no state I've been where out-of-state money isn't unpopular. So if you have that kind of disclosure, and it's timely, it has to be timely before the vote. If you have to have aggressive enforcement, such as they had in California, and it comes out before the vote, it's devastating. And California has not had so much of that problem ever since that case. They've still got problems with hidden money, but at least that loophole, at least that part of it, has been closed off. So the answer is, you know, hang in there and be tough. I mean, you need to find people who are prepared to work for this. And you've got people who are willing to run for office, who are willing to work for this, and smart attorneys, smart legislators. I guarantee you, though, if you go back and fix gerrymandering, and you do public funding of campaigns, you're going to find a very different environment in the legislature to dealing with precisely this issue. I mean, I spent a lot of time trying to trace these things back and figure out where the hell you grab the damn cat, you know, and where you get a hold of the sheep and begin to try to corral them. And I really believe that political reform is essential to do this. In California, you happen to have a governor who is disposed to do this. You happen to have a legislature who is disposed to do this. You can do it in Massachusetts. Let me tell you, I'm following a bunch of people in South Dakota, and they are gutsy. These are reformers in South Dakota that are trying, but they are up against Goliath. I mean, you have no idea. This is a state that is 46% by registration Republican, and the legislature is 80% Republican. I mean, that's how bad the gerrymandering is. So I mean, it's really tough to go fight that kind of thing. So when you think about the state you're in, the opportunity here to continue reform is just, it's terrific.
I want to thank you for outlining some things that are going right in this country and that can give all of us much needed hope. These are all reforms, and I quote you when I say reforms take time. So my question is, how much time do you think this democracy has left?
Well, that's a
For
very important
instance,
question.
and let me mention one thing I mean by that. If the Republicans maintain control of both houses of Congress in Washington after 2018, which hopefully they won't, I am afraid that Trump will be even less controllable, and the last checks and balances might disappear. So my question to you is, how much time do you think we have left?
Well, I think the question you raise, the way you've cast it is cast in a very personal and partisan way, but I think that in terms of Trump and the Republicans, but I think the issues are much more fundamental and they deserve being addressed. We come up to the next census in 2020, which means we come up to the next national gerrymandering in 2021-22. I think that if there is not significant gerrymander reform to create more states with more competitive political districts, the danger of a self-perpetuating party monopoly in this country may not be the end of American democracy, but for an awful lot of people in an awful lot of states, it will be. It already is. South Dakota, I just mentioned to you, is one of them where people are fighting. I think that's really very fundamental. I mean, I'm concerned about the election of 2018. I don't know what the outcome will be, but I've got some feelings about it. But I really think more fundamental is whether or not we can regain the structures that give us a chance to fight back. That's really important. Do we have voting laws that really let everybody at least have the opportunity to vote, even if they don't take it? Do we have district lines drawn so that there is a genuine competition and people have a choice, so that when you talk about issues, as we are today, that the debate that you have about substance actually counts? I mean, that's absolutely critical. I do not see a way around the big money in politics. Somebody mentioned earlier money being the mother's milk of politics. I don't see any way to limit that short of a constitutional amendment. And even with the 19 states, that's only halfway. You got to get to 38, and that's really tough, going from here to there. But the public funding is a way that you can go. It's a way in which people can sense a reconnection with their state legislature and their state government. And the times when America has recovered, I mean, the great progressive movement of the early 19th century, the 20th century, Teddy Roosevelt, the progressives, that whole era came from the bottom up. And it seems to me that's where the strength, that's where the opportunity is. So while I'm focused on 2018, I'm not only focused on that. I think what happens between now and 2022 is really important. And not, we're so focused on who wins the White House. And it's important. I don't want to diminish that. But the Democrats today, and our choice in America today, is limited, and we're in trouble because the Democrats were so focused on winning the White House in 2008, 2012, they didn't worry about state governments, and in lots of states, there's no choice. So, we need to recalibrate our thinking. And the media is not helping us, because the media is always focused. It's really easy to follow one character. I used to be a reporter, way back in the old day. It's really easy to chase a fire truck, right? We've got a fire truck in the White House, literally. I mean, there's a blaze going on every day, and so you report on today's blaze. And do you actually add to people's understanding of policy and events by doing that? No. So it takes a much more sophisticated, variegated approach, it seems to me. So I haven't given up yet, but we're in perilous shape.
Hedrick, my name is Walt Corbin. I live here on Orcas. You hit the nail on the head. The word is more powerful than the sword. The only problem is last year 28% of the people in the United States did not read. And I'm very fearful that this president is bullying the
It's not closeness, it's pointing it. There you go.
Okay. Is bullying the press. And like you said, they're following the fire engine. They're not talking about the real issues that are important to the American people, like health care, inequality, repair of our major infrastructure, you write about the written word that you write about is wonderful, and you write to the choir. We support the words and the wisdom that come from your writing. But what is most important is the general public that is listening to the media, TV and radio, that simply bully the press and don't go after the true story of our democracy. And I think somehow, some way that you, the written side of the media, has to embarrass the word side or the TV, radio side to do something as constructive as you are doing with a written word.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, let me say, Walt, I'm whacking away at it. Let me just address one thing that kind of slid by in the midst of your comments that's really important. And that is the notion that not much has changed since 2016. That and I don't want to just deal with this as a Trump base and as a Republican issue. John McCain was a Republican. Bob Mueller's a Republican. I voted for lots of Republicans. Dwight Eisenhower was a Republican. There were a lot of Republicans that we've had them. What's happening is it's slipping away. But I was preparing for this talk. I was going through some projections on what might happen in Senate races. And I came across a conservative outlet, and it was saying to conservatives and Republicans, don't worry about the Senate, we're in pretty good shape. Trump's approval rating in 13 states, which have competitive or quite competitive Senate races, is really strong everywhere except in Nevada. Only in Nevada is it negative. And I thought to myself, gee, I wonder what Trump's approval rating or his vote percentage was in those same 13 states in 2016. And in every single state but Texas, there was a significant decline. In other words, the supposedly encouraging statistics that were being offered were actually less encouraging than before. My point is that it seems as though nothing is changing and nobody's viewpoint is changing. But in fact, it is happening. And the difficulty is that watching that kind of change is like watching grass grow. You can't see it grow. You only see the lawn after it's up there. And we're only going to know whether or not it's there after on November 7th, and then beyond that. But I think there's pretty good evidence. The women's marches, Student March for Our Lives, the teacher strikes in Arkansas, Oklahoma, Kentucky, West Virginia. Teachers in those states are not only saying we're not being paid well enough, they're saying we as a state are not investing enough in education. They're raising a citizens' protest. Now, admittedly, they're an organized body with a self-interest, but teachers have not been doing that. So when I'm as a reporter, I spent years in Moscow, and I had a hell of a lot less information in Moscow, trying to figure out what was going on in the Soviet Union than I do in America. But I go around and look and try to collect information that's telling me what's going on that hasn't been organized, codified, and then emblazoned in some headline or some event. And I think there's lots of evidence that this country is in a rebellious mood and in a mood for change. Now, part of that I base on the fact that I think the election of 2016 was an election of rebellion. I don't think it was a right-left election. I don't think it was a Republican, a Democratic election. In the general election, it came down to it. But it was perceived as an election of the bottom up. You got to remember, Bernie came from nowhere. This is a guy 73 years old, a self-declared Democratic Socialist from a state with 3 electoral votes. He did not come from Texas or Pennsylvania, or California, Ohio, one of the mighty states. He came out of nowhere and he nearly knocked off an absolutely assumed anointed leader. That tells you, and he lit a fire under a generation that we all believe is totally uninterested in politics. Not true. So all I'm saying is that some of the things we say to ourselves and to each other, living in a fairly narrow social political milieu, and I don't mean just on this island, I have the same kind of conversations in D.C., because I mix with a whole lot of people who got a college education and who are reasonably well off, and so on and so forth. We're not out there with a whole lot of other people. Stuff is happening in this country, and I think you're absolutely right. I would love to embarrass the media. Let me tell you, I wasn't out to embarrass the media. I was out to get my friggin' documentary on the air, and I spent months arguing with PBS, and they couldn't make up their mind, and that's why I went to MSNBC in the end. Okay? So it's not just a matter of embarrassing. I was saying, hey, I'm opening you up. I'm giving you a story nobody else is covering for you. Wouldn't you like it? Too much cynicism. Can't be done. Uninteresting. Okay? The problem isn't just that they're mesmerized by the fire engine. They are. That's easy journalism. They're cynical. They're more cynical in many ways than the public is. And they're a lot younger. We're talking about journalists between 30 and 50 years old. That's a serious tragedy. Anyway, you guys have been great. I want to thank you. I don't want to cut it off. If somebody else has got an urgent question, I'll take it. Yes, particularly if it comes from a lady.
I just want you to speak to the cyber stuff, that election hacking.
The hacking?
The hacking of our election.
I don't know what I can add to what you already know. I mean, it's clear, we have a clear assessment of our intelligence agencies that they hacked the 2016 election, not just got into the Democratic National Committee and Hillary Clinton's emails. What's really important is that in 20 states, they got into election registration electronics. Okay? Everybody is extremely careful to say that they cannot say that ballots were switched, that votes were switched. But there are definitely dozens, if not scores, of cases in Georgia and North Carolina and a couple of other states I can't remember the names of at the moment. Maybe Indiana, Kansas, I'm not sure. But Georgia and North Carolina, I know. There were people who were turned away from the polls who were properly registered, and this was not a matter of the photo ID law, but somehow their registration records have been fooled with. So there have been warnings from the Director of National Intelligence, Dan Coates, former Indiana Republican senator, to the states that they need to do corrective measures now. And you have a bunch of states that have gone to combining electronic and paper ballots, so there's a paper trail to make sure that there can't be interference. But I think we're in a very risky period here. I think we don't know whether or not the Russians will try to fool with the actual vote count, and whether or not they can do so. What appears to be the case, and I have to say, my information is really incomplete, but what appears to be the case is when you have wealthy cities like Los Angeles or New York, and they have fairly sophisticated cybersecurity units that can protect the sanctity of their ballot, that they're taking quite a lot of measures and they're actually spending some money. But if you go into other states, particularly rural states, where there simply just isn't the money, even if there's the will, you simply are not seeing anywhere near that kind of care being taken. And the wherewithal is not there. And this is one of the reasons why you have a number of the intelligence chiefs who have been screaming since last January, February, to the White House and to Trump that you have to allocate more federal funds to help these states protect themselves and the sanctity of the ballot in the states. And I've raised the question a couple of times in blogs that I've written on my website as to whether or not the failure of the president to protect the 2018 election is a violation of his constitutional oath to defend the Constitution of the United States on January 20th, 2017. I mean, it seems to me that, I'm not trying to make a partisan argument there. I'm simply saying, isn't it the duty of the president, if there is a perceived threat from a foreign power to our ability to conduct an election, to put that, somewhere up on number 1, 2, or 3 in his priorities, and to be raising hell about it, not only with Mr. Putin, but with the Congress and with the states and so forth. I mean, I think that's a very fundamental thing. So I'm glad you raised that question. Let me thank you. You're a great audience. We love being with you. To learn more about the victories of citizen reform movements, come to our website, reclaimtheamericandream.org, and click on Success Stories. And check out our YouTube channel, The People versus the Politicians.